Hi, Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane. And if you remember at the end of last chapter, Pellegrina, Abeline's grandma, told quite a story about a princess who did not feel any love. She didn't have a very good and very happy ending, did she? Got turned into a warthog. Why did she tell that story? So now, the beginning of this chapter, it shows, now back especially in the olden days, this would be a chest that maybe would hold your luggage before suitcases, or even bigger than suitcases. And they're going on a journey, as you know. They're going on the Queen Mary, which is, if you look that up on your iPad, the Queen Mary is a huge ocean liner that went from the United States to England and back again. Very fancy. The house on Egypt Street became frantic with activity as the Tulane family prepared for their voyage to England. Edward possessed a small trunk, and Abeline packed it for him, filling it with his finest suits and several of his best hats and 3 pairs of shoes, all so that he might cut a fine figure in London. Before she placed each outfit in the trunk, though, she displayed it to him. "Do you like this shirt with this suit?" she'd ask him. Or, "Would you like to wear your black derby hat? You look very handsome in it. Shall we pack it?" And then finally, on a bright Saturday morning in May, Edward, Abeline, and Mr. and Mrs. Tulane were all on board the ship, standing at the railing. Pellegrina was at the dock. On her head she wore a floppy hat strung around with flowers. She stared straight at Edward. Her dark eyes glowed. "Goodbye," Abeline shouted to her grandmother. "I love you." The ship pulled away from the dock, and Pellegrina waved to Abeline. "Goodbye, lady," she called. "Goodbye." Edward felt something damp in his ears, and Abeline's tears, he supposed. He wished that she would not hold him so tight. To be clutched so fiercely often resulted in wrinkled clothing. Finally, all the people on land, including Pellegrina, disappeared. Edward, for one, was relieved to see the last of her. As was to be expected, Edward Tulane exacted much attention on board the ship. "What a singular rabbit," said an elderly lady with 3 strings of pearls wrapped around her neck. She bent down to look more closely at Edward. "Thank you," said Abeline. Several little girls on board gave Edward deep glances full of longing. They asked Abeline if they might hold him. "No," said Abeline, "I'm afraid that he's not the kind of rabbit who likes to be held by strangers." 2 young boys, brothers named Martin and Amos, took a particular interest in Edward. "What does he do?" Martin asked Abeline on their second day at sea. He pointed at Edward, who was sitting on a deck chair with his long legs stretched in front of him. "He doesn't do anything," said Abeline. "Does he wind up somewhere?" said Amos. "No," said Abeline, "he does not wind up." "What's the point of him, then?" said Martin. "The point is that he is Edward," said Abeline. "That's not much of a point," said Amos. "It's not," agreed Martin. And then after a long, thoughtful pause, he said, "I wouldn't let anybody dress me like that." "Me neither," said Amos. "Do his clothes come off?" asked Martin. "Of course they do," said Abeline. "He has many different outfits. And he has his own pajamas, too. They're all made of silk." Edward, as usual, was disregarding the conversation. A breeze was blowing in off the sea, and the silk scarf wrapped around his neck billowed out behind him. On his head he wore a straw boater. The rabbit was thinking he must look quite dashing. So it came as a total surprise to him when he was grabbed off the deck chair, and first his scarf and then his jacket and pants were ripped from his body. He heard his pocket watch hit the deck of the ship, and then held upside down he watched the watch roll merrily towards Abeline's feet. "Look at him," said Martin. "He's even got underwear." He held Edward aloft so that Amos could see him. "Take it off," shouted Amos. "No!" screamed Abeline. Martin removed Edward's underwear. "What would you say about these guys? Is it their doll? No, they're just total bullies." Edward was paying attention now. He was mortified. He was completely naked except for the hat on his head, and the other passengers on board the ship were looking at him, directing curious and embarrassed glances his way. "Give him to me," screamed Abeline. "He's mine." "No," said Amos to Martin. "Give him to me." He clapped his hands together and then held them open. "Toss him," he said. "Please," cried Abeline, "don't throw him. He's made of china. He'll break." Remember, china is like glass, and it can shatter. And that's what he's made of. Martin threw Edward, and Edward sailed naked through the air. Only a moment ago, the rabbit had thought that being naked in front of a shipload of strangers was the worst thing that could happen to him. But he was wrong. It was much worse being tossed in that same naked state from the hands of one grubby laughing boy to another. Amos caught Edward and held him up, displaying him triumphantly. "Throw him back," called Martin. And Amos raised his arm, but just as he was getting ready to throw Edward, Abilene tackled him, shoving her head into his stomach and upsetting the boy's aim. And so it was that Edward did not go flying back into the dirty hands of Martin. Instead, Edward Tulane went overboard. Overboard. So what does he think that's flying through the sky? His hat? His derby? Just because they were so mean. How does a China rabbit die? Can a China rabbit drown? Is my hat still on my head? These were the questions that Edward asked himself as he went sailing out over the blue sea. The sun was high in the sky, and from what seemed to be a very long way away, Edward heard Abilene call his name. "Edward!" she shouted. "Come back!" Come back? Of all the ridiculous things to shout, thought Edward. As he tumbled ears over tail through the air, he managed to catch one last glimpse of Abilene. She was standing on the deck of the ship, holding onto the railing with one hand, and in her other hand was a lamp. No, it was a ball of fire. No, Edward realized it was his gold pocket watch that Abilene held in her hand. She was holding it up high, and it was reflecting the light of the sun. My pocket watch, he thought. I need that. So that is the ship. And there's Edward. Overboard. You know, the ocean is extremely deep. And then Abilene disappeared from view, and the rabbit hit the water with such tremendous force that his hat blew off his head. That answers that question, thought Edward as he watched the hat dance away in the wind. And then he began to sink. He sank and sank and sank. And he kept his eyes open the whole time, not because he was brave, but because he had no choice. His painted-on eyes witnessed the blue water turning to green and then to blue again, and they watched as it finally became as black as night. And Edward went down and down, and he said to himself, if I'm going to drown, certainly I would have done it by now. And far above him, the ocean liner with Abilene aboard it sailed blithely on. The China rabbit landed finally on the ocean floor, face down. And there, with his head in the muck, he experienced his first, genuine, and true emotion. Edward Tulane was afraid. So fear is an emotion. Something we feel, right? Fear, happiness, anger, joy. So those would be some big ocean waves, right? He told himself that certainly Abilene would come and find him. This, Edward thought, is much like waiting for Abilene to come home from school. I will pretend that I am in the dining room of the house on Egypt Street, waiting for the little hand to move to the 3 and the big hand to land on the 12. If only I had my watch, then I would know for sure. But it doesn't matter. She will be here soon, very soon. Hours passed, and then days, and weeks, and months, and Abilene did not come. And Edward, for lack of anything better to do, began to think. He thought about the stars, and he remembered what they looked like from his bedroom window. What made them shine so brightly, he wondered, and were they still shining somewhere even though he could not see them? Never in my life, he thought, have I been farther away from the stars than I am now. He considered, too, the fate of the beautiful princess who had become a warthog. Why had she become a warthog? Because the ugly witch turned her into one, that was why. But then the rabbit thought about Pellegrina, and he felt in some way that he could not explain to himself that she was responsible for what had happened to him. It was almost as if she and not the boys had thrown Edward overboard. She was like the witch in the story. No, she was the witch in the story. True, she did not turn him into a warthog, but just the same, she was punishing him. Although for what, he could not say. On the 297th day of Edward's ordeal, a storm came. So how long is a year? Do you know that? How many days? A year is 365 days. So he's been on the ocean floor for 297 days, so almost a year. And a storm came. And the storm was so powerful that it lifted Edward off the ocean floor and led him in a crazy, wild, spinning dance. The water pummeled him and lifted him up and shoved him back down. Help, thought Edward. The storm in its ferocity actually flung him all the way out of the sea, and the rabbit glimpsed for a moment the light of an angry and bruised sky. The wind rushed through his ears. It sounded to him like Pellegrina was laughing, and before he had time to appreciate being above water, he was tossed back down into the depths. Up and down, back and forth he went, until the storm wore itself out and Edward saw that he was beginning again his slow descent to the ocean floor. Oh, help me, he thought. I can't go back there. Please help me. But still down he went. Down, 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 and then suddenly a great wide net of a fisherman reached out and grabbed the rabbit. The net lifted him higher and higher until there was an almost unbearable explosion of light, and Edward was back in the world, lying on the deck of a ship surrounded by fish. Hey, what's this? Said a voice. I ain't no fish, said another voice, that's for sure. The light was so brilliant that it was hard for Edward to see, and finally shapes appeared out of the light and then faces. Remember, he's been in the ocean for almost a year, so all of a sudden he's put on the boat deck of a fisherman, and he's like, oh my gosh, the light. Then he realized there were faces, and Edward realized he was looking up at two men, one young and one old. Looks like some toy, said the grizzled old man. He bent and picked Edward up and held him by his front paws, considering him. A rabbit, I reckon. It's got whiskers, or rabbit ears, or the shape of rabbit ears at least. Yeah, I'm sure it was a rabbit toy, said the younger man, and he turned away. I'll take it home to Nellie. Let her fix him up and set her to rights. We'll give it to some child. The old man placed Edward carefully in a crate, positioning him so that he was sitting up and could look out at the sea. And Edward appreciated the courtesy of this small gesture, but he was heartily sick of the ocean, and he would have been satisfied never to set eyes on it again. There you go, said the old man. And as they made their way back to shore, Edward felt the sun on his face and the wind blowing through the little bit of fur left in his ears, and something filled in his chest, a wonderful feeling. He was glad to be alive. That's another emotion, isn't it? Appreciation. He's glad to be alive. Look at that rabbit, the old man said. Looks like he's enjoying the ride, don't it? Yep, said the young man. In fact, Edward Tulane was so happy to be back among the living that he didn't even get upset or take umbrage at being referred to as it. So does he look as awesome as he used to look? Remember, Eveline took such good care of him and they had the best clothes and everything was amazing. Well, he's been in the ocean for almost a year. So you can see he's looking a little rough. Looks like he's got some seaweed on his head and there's a fisherman taking him with him. See what happens next. On land, the old fisherman stopped to light a pipe, and then with the pipe clenched between his teeth, he walked home carrying Edward atop his left shoulder, as if he were a conquering hero. The fisherman balanced him there, placing a calloused hand at Edward's back, and he talked to him in a soft, low voice as they walked. You'll like Nellie, you will, said the old man. She's had her sadness, but she's an all right girl. And Edward looked at the small town blanketed in dusk, a jumble of buildings huddled together and the ocean stretching out in front of it all, and he thought that he would like anything or anybody that was not at the bottom of the sea. Hello, Lawrence, called a woman from the front of the shop. What you got? Fresh catch, said the fisherman. Fresh rabbit from the sea. He lifted his cap to the lady and kept walking. So manners, if you wear a hat and somebody says hi, you can kind of lift your cap like, hello, how you doing? There you are now, said the fisherman. He took the pipe out of his mouth and pointed with the stem at the star of the purpling sky. There's your North Star right there. Don't ever have to be lost when you know where that fellow is. Do you know where the North Star is at night? It's very bright, and that helps people to tell where they're at, where the directions are. Edward considered the brightness of the small star. Do they all have names? He wondered. And do you know about constellations? About the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper and Orion? There's lots of different constellations, the shapes of the stars, and there's stories about them. It's pretty interesting. Listen to me, said the fisherman, talking to the toy. Oh, well, here we are then. And with Edward still on his shoulder, the fisherman walked up a stone-lined path and into a little green house. Look here, Nellie, he said. I brought you something from the sea. I don't want nothing from the sea, came a voice. Aw, now don't be like that, Nell. Come on and see then. and an old woman stepped out of the kitchen wiping her hands on an apron. But when she saw Edward, she dropped the apron. She clapped her hands together and she said, "Oh, Lawrence, you brung me a rabbit." "Direct from the sea," said Lawrence. He took Edward off his shoulder and stood him up on the floor and held him onto his hands and made him take a deep bow in the direction of Nellie. "Oh," said Nellie, "here." She clasped her hands together and... These darn interruptions. She clapped her hands together again and Lawrence passed Edward to her. Nellie held the rabbit out in front of her and looked him over from tip to toe. She smiled. "Have you ever in your life seen anything so fine?" she said. So that's Nellie. Nellie's looking at Edward. And that's Lawrence who brought Nellie Edward. And she seems very happy to see Edward. Edward felt immediately that Nellie was a very discerning woman. "She's beautiful," breathed Nellie. For a moment, Edward was confused. Was there some other object of beauty in this room? "What will I call her?" "Susanna," said Lawrence. "Just right," said Nellie. "Susanna." And she looked deep into Edward's eyes. "First off, Susanna will need some clothes, won't she?" Susanna. Because Edward was at the bottom of the sea for so long, I guess he looks like a Susanna. So look at this outfit. Nellie dressed him in a dress. Very cute dress. But he's Edward. And so Edward Tulane became Susanna. Nellie sewed several outfits for him, a pink dress with ruffles for special occasions, a simple shift fashioned out of a flower-covered cloth for everyday use, and a long white gown made of cotton for Edward to sleep in. In addition, she remade his ears, stripping them of the few pieces of fur that remained and designing him a new pair. "Oh," she told him when she was done, "you look lovely." He was horrified at first. He was, after all, a boy rabbit, and he did not want to be dressed as a girl, and the outfits, even the special occasion dress, it was so simple and so plain, and they lacked the elegance and artistry of real clothes. But then Edward remembered lying on that ocean floor and the muck in his face and the stars so far away, and he really said to himself, "What difference does it make anyway, really? Wearing a dress won't hurt me. At least I'm not on the ocean floor anymore." Besides, life in that little greenhouse with the fisherman and his wife was sweet. Nellie loved to bake, so she spent her days in the kitchen. She'd put Edward on the counter and lean him up against the flour canister and arrange his dress around his knees, and she'd bend his ears so he could hear well. And then she would set to work kneading dough for the bread and rolling out dough for cookies and pies. And the kitchen soon filled with the smell of baking bread and with the sweet smells of cinnamon and sugar and cloves. And the windows steamed up, and while Nellie worked, she talked. She told Edward about her children, her daughter Lolly, who was a secretary, and her boys, Ralph, who was in the army, and Raymond, who had died of pneumonia when he was only 5 years old. "He drowned inside of himself," said Nellie. "It's a horrible, terrible thing, the worst thing to watch somebody you love die right in front of you and not be able to do nothing about it. I dream about him most nights." So do you remember when Lawrence said that Nellie is very sad all the time? And she has been because, of course, she lost a son. Nellie wiped at the tears in the back of her hands and she smiled at Edward. "I suppose you think I'm daft talking to a toy, but it seems to me you're listening, Susanna." And Edward was surprised to discover that he was listening. Before, when Abilene talked to him, everything had seemed so boring and so pointless, but now the stories Nellie told struck him in the most important thing in the world, because it was the most important thing in his world, and he listened as if his life depended on what she said. It made him wonder if some muck in the ocean floor had gotten inside his china head and damaged him somehow. And in the evening, Lawrence came home from the sea, and there was dinner, and Edward sat at the table with the fisherman and his wife, and he sat in an old wooden high chair. And while at first he was mortified, a high chair, after all, was a chair designed for babies, not for elegant rabbits, he soon became used to it. He liked being up high, looking out over the table instead of staring at the tablecloth as he had done in the Tulane household. He liked feeling like a part of things. And every night after dinner, Lawrence said that he thought he would go out and get some fresh air and that maybe Susanna would like to come with him. And he placed Edward on his shoulder as he had that first night when he walked him through the town, and he'd bring him home to Nellie. And they went outside, and Lawrence lit his pipe and held Edward there on his shoulder. And if the night was clear, Lawrence said the names of the constellations one at a time. Andromeda, Pegasus. He would always point to them up in the sky with the stem of his pipe. And Edward loved looking at the stars, and he loved the sounds of the constellation names. They were sweet to his ears. And sometimes, though, staring up at the night sky, Edward remembered Pellegrina and saw again her dark and glowing eyes, and a chill would go through him. Warthogs, he would think, witches. But Nellie, before she put him to bed each night, sang Edward a lullaby, a song about a mockingbird that did not sing and a diamond ring that would not shine. And the sound of Nellie's voice soothed the rabbit, and he forgot about Pellegrina. Life for a long, very long time was sweet. And then Lawrence and Nellie's daughter came for a visit. Well, that shouldn't be bad, should it? Unfortunately, it will be.